Rudyard Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this, the regular Friday Roundtable. I'm joined by Sean Speer, editor-at-large, coming to us from our redoubt behind enemy lines in New York City. After that big game, Sean, I would not be walking around the streets of New York with your Canadian toque and paraphernalia that you sport in the Big Apple.
Yeah, no kidding. You know what's funny, Roger, is that I have all of these subtle ways in which I try to inject Canadiana into our binational household. And one that I really hold the line on is the use of the word toque. Our 4-year-old and 2-year-old know them as toques, and I'm sure that creates a lot of confusion at the preschool. But it's my way to stand up for Canada against the American aggression. And last night, of course, was another big way for Canada to stand up for American aggression. Did you watch the game, Rudyard?
Yes, I did, Sean. Now, you are our resident hockey expert, a veteran of the rinks of Thunder Bay. So what did you make of it? I mean, you're a diehard Leaf fan, serially disappointed, and here the NHL, to their credit, puts on a fantastic tournament, a big show, a huge finish, and come on, he gets to score the winning goal in overtime. I mean, you could not write this script in a Hollywood movie.
Yeah, there's so much to say about the past week or 10 days in international hockey. As you say, it's been a tremendous success, both in terms of the product on the ice, but also I think the viewership and the revenues that it's generated. My one major takeaway, Roger, as someone who watches a lot of hockey, virtually every night, at least a little bit, best on best hockey is just another level. You start to distinguish between elite players and generational players. And I think what the way to understand last night's game is, in the end, our generational players outplayed their generational players. And that's why Canada remains on the top of on the top of the hockey world.
Yeah, I had the same thought as a total hockey kind of neophyte, that the quality of play was so dynamic, so fast. What does this do to the rest of the game for the rest of the year? Now that we've been spoiled with this, you kind of wonder. A lot of other sports, Sean, do have these kind of super leagues where they do take the best of the best. Hockey does a little bit of that around the World Cup and other things, but wow, you get a taste for that last night. I don't know if I can go back to watching the Leafs, slug it out here at the Air Canada Center.
Yeah, some of the fans who've been brought to the game through this tournament are going to be disappointed watching the Columbus Blue Jackets play the Chicago Blackhawks on a February Wednesday. One of the cooler things, though, Roger, I think you know this about me. I'm really interested in the economics of hockey, and at the risk of getting a bit wonky here, the way that the salary cap works is the players have a 50% dedicated share of revenue, which has created a kind of partnership between the league and the Players Association. I think that's really what's behind the success of this week's event. Both have direct interest in growing the game and growing its revenues. And I think congratulations, of course, to Canada, but congratulations to the NHL and the Players Association. It's one of the most successful efforts, I think, to reach new and different hockey audiences that I've seen almost in my entire lifetime. And then, of course, for this to be happening, Roger, against the backdrop of bilateral tensions and these provocations from President Trump, I mean, you couldn't possibly have written a better script. We often say at the Hub, sometimes you got to be lucky to be good. And man, the people who carried out this event over the past week were sure lucky.
And Connor McDavid, how big a rock star is he today?
Well, I mean, viewers who know me a bit will know that I'm a Sidney Crosby guy. I just think Sidney Crosby is someone who entered the league 20 years ago with sky high expectations, and he has exceeded them, both as a player and as a person. And so what was really cool last night, 15 years after Sidney Crosby, of course, scored the golden goal in Vancouver, we have Connor McDavid, the next major superstar, scoring the winning goal last night. At the risk of sounding like a bit of a geriatric millennial and a bit nostalgic, it did feel like a bit of a changing of the guard, a bit of a moment where we saw the transition to McDavid as the key player, both for Canada and for the NHL.
Yeah. Well, Sean, let's dig into the show because there's a lot of politics here in Canada and internationally that we want to unpack on today's roundtable. Before we do that, though, a whole whack of new fellows joining the Hub this week. So just thank you so much, Morris P., James R., Colette P., Virginia M., David T., Gilad A, and Natasha B, for your generous support coming on board as lifetime subscribers. All the benefits of the Hub plus a coveted Hub Fellows baseball cap. We're sending those out in the mail to you next week. So thank you all, guys. Really greatly appreciate it. Sean, I want to come to politics because it was an action-packed week here off the ice in the rink that we know from Ottawa to Vancouver to Halifax, where the other national pastime is played. And the week has been bookended by this big victory by the Canadian team, but it began with Pierre Poilievre's speech on Saturday, where he kind of put a message of some sobriety and seriousness out regarding standing up for Canada against U.S. threats and really trying to modernize and future-proof the Canadian economy to deal with this intransigent, at times seemingly off-the-rails U.S. administration. But I want to show for you, Sean, a graph that we've got of a poll that you and I both kind of put our jaws down around the floor when we saw it. It's from Angus Reid, and I'll explain this to our listeners. Basically, it's showing steady decline in Liberal support from 2023 right through to early 2025, and then a rocket exploding as the Liberal leadership begins. And this is Angus Reid, so this is a quality pollster showing that as of today, the Conservatives are at 40% nationally in terms of vote intention, and the Liberals have skyrocketed in the course of less than a few weeks from 16% to 37% in this Angus Reid poll, within the margin of error of Conservative vote intention. What do you make of this, Sean? What's the story behind these numbers?
Yeah, it's striking, isn't it? There's so much to say. It seems to me as interesting as the story is about that massive growth in the Liberal number from what amounted to something like a historical nadir to now being competitive with the Conservatives, is that the Conservative numbers have by and large held, Rudyard. If you would have told Pierre Poilievre 18 months ago that heading into a prospective election, the party was at something like 40%, he would have said that reflected a measure of success for him and the Conservatives. I mention that because I think the real story here is that Mark Carney's candidacy seems to have caused the New Democrats to essentially bottom out, which creates, in theory, two-party races across the country. And the reason why that's important, of course, is the efficiency of the Liberal vote. And so obviously, there's a lot to happen in the coming weeks and months. One doesn't want to get ahead of him or herself. But if something like those numbers held, Rudyard, we could, in theory, be looking at as much as a Liberal majority, just by virtue of essentially two-party races across the country and the efficiency of the Liberal vote in and around major urban centers. This is a kind of extraordinary development in our politics. The political landscape has been changed, and we went from having what looked to be a coronation of Pierre Poilievre as our next prime minister into a real and serious race in the next election.
And also, Sean, it invokes, that doomsday scenario that we were talking about late last year, which is that even if the Conservatives do not, perform here and hold these numbers at 40, the risk, as you say, isn't simply a Liberal majority. It's the potential for a repeat of some kind of supply agreement, some kind of partnership between the Liberals and the NDP to deny the Conservatives a throne speech, to defeat them, through parliamentary means by, in a sense, reassembling the Jagmeet Singh Trudeau coalition. So the bar, Sean, I've always felt for the Conservatives, unfortunately, it's not fair,
Yeah.
but it's higher. That short of a majority, I don't see how they prevail here. And what worries me, Sean, is the clear momentum on the Liberal side. And I think this is what I want to focus with you on. I think it has very little to do with Pierre Poilievre. I think it has very little to do with the Conservative Party. I think it has everything to do with Donald Trump and his destabilization of Canadians and their sense of security, their sense of what happens next. And I want to go to a quote we've got up on a board that I think goes to the essence of what is needling all of us and possibly behind that surge in Liberal numbers. This was the president on Thursday before the big game. He said, "I do like O Canada, all right. It's a beautiful thing. We're going to have to keep it for the 51st state." I mean, the level of insult there and the underlying threat, the continuing kind of menace of, for me, Sean, I think you agree on this, it's the 51st state stuff, less now than much more than the tariffs, that's causing, I think, this total rebalancing and reshifting of the political footings here in Canada. Do you agree?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And what strikes me, Roger, having been in Miami last weekend for a major center-right conference on technology and trade and globalization, then, of course, just spending a lot of time in the United States, this is just not on Americans' radar at all. There is a total lack of empathy and understanding about how these provocations are being received by Canadians. As you say, while Canadians are concerned about the economic fallout from tariffs, and if I can make a plug, on Monday we have exclusive polling from Polera that shows how concerned Canadians are about tariffs. In a way, that is a technocratic question. It's these continued incessant threats of Canada becoming the 51st state, which has struck at something much more visceral, much deeper, and that, I think, is what has shifted the political landscape in Canada, and what Pierre Poilievre was trying to speak to in this speech over the weekend, that him and his people are rejecting the premise it represented a pivot, but it self-evidently was a new and different way to talk about his candidacy, his understanding of the issues facing the country, and how he would go about responding to them. You might call it a non-pivot pivot. I think it's too early to say if it achieved what him and the Conservatives needed to achieve, which is to effectively stabilize and stop the bleeding that we're seeing. But it does, I think, represent the extent to which the ballot question, as we've talked about over the past couple of episodes, is going to be a lot different heading into the next election than the one that the Conservatives have been preparing for the better part of the past 2 years.
Yeah. And I think we agree, increasing that ballot question is, who's best to defend Canada? And, well, the verdict's out on Pierre Poilievre versus Mark Carney. It's clear that the verdict is in on Jagmeet Singh, and the NDP is just a deeply unserious party with a deeply unserious leader, which, as you say, then radically increases Liberal, voting efficiency. And again, what I worry about, Sean, is just the very high bar here, the necessity for the Conservatives to win not just a plurality of the votes, but a majority of the seats in Parliament in order to stave off what I think would be an obvious but craven repeat of the Singh-Trudeau agreement, this time, manufactured and fabricated by Mark Carney on, again, as implausible as that pairing is, I think it would be justified on the basis of the Liberal Party's, utter animus towards even the idea that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives could form government. So what before we break on the first half of the show, what are you going to look for to try to understand where the trend line goes from here? Because that Ipsos poll, if we go back to it here, I mean, it's showing like a vertical here in terms of liberal support. So is it when these two lines cross? Is it if we see the Conservatives falling into the 30s that you have to start thinking that maybe last Saturday's speech wasn't enough and there needs to be something more done to kind of blunt this parabolic rise in liberal support?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's going to require a deft touch and a kind of degree of empathy that hasn't always been Pierre Poilievre's principal political skill. His argument up until now has been primarily an economic one. And let me use that point to step back a little bit and even maybe talk about the way that you and I have thought about these issues. I think that there's a criticism sometimes, Rudyard, of the Roundtable. It's that we're both inclined towards political economy. You might even characterize it as a kind of economic determinism. I grew up in the household of an entrepreneur who sort of saw the world through the lens of economics, and that oftentimes is reflected in our conversation. But it's easy to forget in a previous life, you were dedicated to the promotion and advancement of Canadian history, of Canadian identity, of a sense of Canadian nationhood. And I think in a way, we are walking into one of the first elections in my lifetime that is poised not to be a pocketbook election, that really is going to be animated by some of these more fundamental questions. If I can make a plug for our listeners and viewers, next week we're going to have a exclusive podcast with former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, where we talk about these issues of identity and culture and collective narratives. And he's found his voice on these issues. We saw that reflected in a major op-ed that ran across not just the Post media chain, but also ended up in the Globe and Mail yesterday. And it seems to me that Pierre Poilievre is going to have to find his voice on those issues as well. We saw some of that in Saturday's speech. The question, of course, as he can is whether he can sustain it. And maybe, Rudyard, he needs to go back to some of that old work that you did at the Dominion Institute, because in a kind of funny way, I think that work is more important now than it's been in a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing we can all, I think, take some solace in is that the pointless, damaging conversations about Canada as a post-national state are over. Yes. And that the serial kind of abuse of our founding fathers, our history, our national symbols and identity is now, deeply politically toxic for liberals. And they're going to have to be really careful about lapsing into the whole Trudeau theory of the case that we were a post-national country. I'm going to end this segment just by offering some unsolicited advice to the Conservatives. And I think what I thought was missing on Saturday's speech by Pierre Poilievre was a leader showing that he was capable of receiving as well as broadcasting. Pierre Poilievre is so effective as a communicator. He's great in that speech, and he's so good at putting messages out. But what I think voters want is a sense of a leader who can receive information, who can be seen as able to adapt and meet a moment and engage with that moment and show, in a sense, flexibility without, abandoning or losing one's principles. And a set piece speech is kind of obviously the wrong way to go about communicating that. But I think he could do that by doing something that he's resisted to this point. Going out and meeting with the heads of Canada's largest voluntary organizations that are working in, communities, retraining people for, jobs that could, again, become really destabilized by tariffs. Maybe meet with some Canadian CEOs, bring them together, hear what their point of view is, hear how large corporations can play a role in future-proofing Canada against American economic threats. In other words, get out of the mentality that it's always broadcast all the time and get into showing Canadians that you're also a receiver of goodwill, of information, of partnership, of people who share your vision of a stronger, self-reliant Canada, that's capable of meeting this challenge. That's, Sean, what I feel like is missing right now. And I think that's something that Canadians would really welcome in a leader at this moment, a feeling that they're not just purely ideological. They're not fixed in position. They are listening. And it's that corny word, a listening tour. But I think that's what he needs to do now to show that he's got more range, that he can, as a leader, assume a bigger place on the national stage and a wider spectrum of how he communicates and interacts with the public and different groups in our society.
Yeah, well said. I think there's something really to that. It would show him in a different light, as you say. It would bring into his thinking and decision making new and different voices. It would also, Roger, start to lay a foundation with Canadians on what the future holds. In Poilievre's speech, I don't recall the precise line, but he warned that protecting Canadian independence, protecting Canadian dignity is going to come with some cost. And I think we need to make sure that we are building as wide a coalition of Canadians who are committed to that vision, but also understand what it will mean for them over this period of heightened uncertainty and real risk. Bringing Canadians along not only, I think, will have a short-term effect, as you say, of showing him in a different light. I think it'll also be important over the medium and long term to make sure that people understand that we're all in this together, because it's going to be a pretty rocky ride, and I think it takes leadership to help people get through it.
Yeah, people want pragmatism as well as principles, and I think he's capable of offering both. Let's say goodbye to our complimentary listeners and viewers. We're going to keep those of you who've tuned into this live stream of today's Roundtable connected with us, and we're going to rejoin our Hub heroes and fellows on the other side of this short break. We're going to dig into what the heck's going on globally, because this was a big week with some big moves by the Trump administration in Saudi Arabia, in Ukraine, in Russia. Where does Canada fit into this? We're going to unpack that for you right after this short break. Welcome back to the Friday Roundtable. Rudyard Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. I'm joined by Sean Speer, my editor-at-large. Sean, a consequential week on the international stage. We don't often talk, global affairs, but I think this week we should, because we have a new series we're running, you and the team, Canada in a Changing World. You're featuring voices that are trying to help Canadians think through where do we situate ourselves if indeed we are moving into a world not of a single great power or hyperpower, but instead a world of major powers, of which America is one, and more dedicated, as other major powers have been in the past, to pursuing its own self-interest. Sean, where do you come down on this? Because this week certainly looked like a big pivot on the part of the Trump administration away from a lot of the traditional tenets of, America and its place in the world.
Yeah. One thing we're trying to do through this series, I'm grateful that you mentioned it, is to, in a way, empathize with some of the ideas and motivations reflected in the Trump administration. One doesn't have to agree with them, of course, but it strikes us as a useful way for conceiving of our own policy agenda, our own understanding of our self-interest, to try to situate it in what's happening in DC. And as easy it is to say that, Roger, I have to admit, this past week has made that effort much more difficult. Even if one, as you say, accepts that part of what's motivating the administration is this sense that that its role as a unipolar superpower is no longer meeting the country's interests, and it needs to, in effect, induce a transition in the global order and changes to global institutions and America's relationship to the world. I can't think of a more obnoxious way to go about doing that. Listen, I have my own misgivings about the lack of leadership in Europe. Its sclerotic economies, its unseriousness when it comes to defense and security issues. I admit that there was parts of J.D. Vance's speech in Munich last week, rather, that I got some joy or pleasure out of. But what we've seen over the past several days, not just going about trying to secure some sort of settlement in the Russia-Ukraine war, but essentially characterizing Ukraine as the source of the problem, just strikes me as such a morally inverted way to understand the world, that my capacity for empathy is admittedly hitting a bit of a limit this week.
Yeah. Look, there's so many ways to go with this, but I think that the thing to realize is that, I mean, this was a norm-shattering week globally, and that really matters. I mean, when you effectively, in the form of the Trump administration, are calling Zelensky a dictator, you are musing that Russia should be let back into the G7. You are promoting the idea, again, Kremlin kind of talking points, that that Ukraine caused this war. I mean, they were brutally attacked. They've lost hundreds of thousands of their soldiers. Their cities have been indiscriminately missiled, droned, and shelled by Putin and by Russia, and you're now blaming the victim for what's happened to them, and effectively saying they don't deserve a seat at the table because they could have ended this war years ago, so we're going to negotiate terms on their behalf that advance our efforts. And oh, by the way, Ukraine, you need to pay us hundreds of billions of dollars in rare earth minerals because suddenly, all those hundreds of billions of dollars that we've spent on American military hardware made in our country is of no value to us, and you've just ripped us off. I mean, it is so staggeringly un-American, right? It's just, to me, this was a week that was a bit destabilizing for me to hear this stuff, because look, you and I have had discussions about this in the past. I think you know that I've felt that this war was not winnable, and that these bizarre ideas like retaking Crimea were loony, and that some negotiated settlement did have to happen, and that the killing of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians was ultimately unsustainable as a much smaller population and country than Russia. But to see this brought to the type of conversation, I don't even call it a conversation, the type of brutal rhetoric and posturing that we saw to the Trump administration this week, just frankly, Sean, shocked me. And we are not 1 month into a 4-year term for this administration. What the heck happens next?
Yeah. One of the reasons why I've personally been involved in this series that we've launched at the Hub, and we had great pieces this week from Charlie McMillan, someone who spent a lot of time in the world of policy and politics. Next week we have Fen Hampson and Tim Sargent, and we'll have a lot of other big thinkers over the coming weeks. Is not because I'm a foreign policy expert, quite the opposite. What I bring to the table in a conversation like this, Rudyard, is in a way I'm an expert on American conservatism and the modern American conservative movement. And one of the insights that I've shared over the course of these conversations is, for the most of my life, the center of gravity on the American right had been in favor of American primacy. That it was taken for granted that America was a shining city on the hill, and the extent to which there were those in favor of a different way of thinking about America's place in the world, they were the minority voices. And what's striking today, Rudyard, in 2025, is if you step back and think about it, who are the prominent political voices in the United States in favor of unipolarity, who reject the premise that the transition to multipolarity is baked in, that it is, for all intents and purposes, happening, and that all American can do to respond to it? The answer is essentially no one. I suppose one could argue that Senator Tom Cotton might be that voice, but because of his positioning vis-a-vis the Trump administration, even he hasn't been as full-throated as, say, Ronald Reagan was in the 1980s. And so that's the part here that strikes me the most is and the reason why I thought we ought to do this. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just the silence of the Republican establishment, through the Senate, through many retired officials now who seem to have just clammed up. Sean, final point in this as we wrap up the show. What worries me is I feel like in conservative circles, there's this fatalism that is evidencing itself where people are arguing, including here in Canada, that, the post fall of the Berlin Wall era is over. We are in an inevitably moving towards, if not in, this so-called multipolar reality of, I guess the contention is, equal or peer-like, major powers, China, Russia, the United States, who now will face off each other, and America is simply behaving, acknowledging this multipolar reality and doing what it needs to do to secure its future economically, geopolitically, and elsewise. I just want to, say that that's kind of bullshit. America is undoubtedly the world's commanding power. Militarily, it spends, I don't know what, like 4 times as much as the Chinese, its nearest competitor. Technologically, it dominates. It dominates in terms of market capitalization and the prowess of AI, cloud, all the major kind of stacks of, the technological society that we live in. It owns all of that from stem to stern. And I could go on and on. I mean, the entire GDP of Russia fits inside New Jersey, for Christ's sakes. This is a choice. Sorry, this is a choice multipolarity. It is not some inevitability or something that's happened or something that's, being responded to because it has to be responded to by the Trump administration. This is a choice to move away from American supremacy, and I think all the benefits that have come to America for having that position, that top spot for the last 3 decades. And I just reject this contention that we, that this is the only path forward, and it's all kind of smart 3-dimensional chess to reposition the United States, Canada, and the world for this, different future.
Yeah. Someone once said, Roger, I forget who, that if America's tenure as the global superpower came to an end, it wouldn't be precipitated by an external challenger. It would be carried out internally. And I think that's right. What we're seeing, for all intents and purposes, is a unilateral surrender, a decision on the part of the United States. It just doesn't want to do this anymore. And I think that's bad for the United States. I think it's bad for the world. And I would just say, to go back to my earlier point about the absence of anyone seemingly making this case in the United States, I'm not even convinced that it's bad politics. Like, I would love to be able to run a counterfactual, Rudyard, and have someone make the kind of Reaganite, full-throated case for the benefits and the need for America to remain the global superpower. And my sense is that actually that's a message that still resonates with the American population. And so that's what makes it so perplexing that voice has just disappeared from the American political landscape.
Yeah. Well, Sean, we will continue to dig into this, and we urge listeners and viewers to check out our series, Canada in a Changing World. We're going to keep it going for a couple of weeks here, just to drill down into some of the big consequences of these radical moves coming out of the Trump administration on foreign policy and defense. Sean, thank you so much for coming on the Roundtable today. We had a fulsome conversation. We went from hockey to domestic politics to the world stage. We did it all, and we'll do it all again next Friday. Be well, my friend. Bye-bye.
Here, bye-bye.